My name is Alex Jinich-Diamant. I'm a neuroscientist and doctoral candidate at UC San Diego School of Medicine. And I'm a guest in Dr. Eleanor Stein podcast. Um, and in this episode, you will hear me speak about a recent study that our group published based on a meditation retreat by Dr. Joe Dispenza, where we look at the effects of the retreat on the brain and on the body. And we also discuss some of the theories and ideas behind what could be driving these ways in which the mind can affect deep changes in the body and its biology.
I'm Dr. Ellie Stein, welcoming you to another episode of the Dr. Eleanor Stein podcast. On this episode, I'm honored to be speaking with Alex Jinich-Diamant. Alex is a doctoral researcher and PhD candidate in the departments of cognitive science and anesthesiology at the University of California at San Diego School of Medicine. His scientific research is centered on the mind-body connection, with a particular focus on the neurophysiology of non-pharmacological analgesia, meditation, and mystical experience. He employs neuroscientific and molecular biology techniques, including functional MRI, multi-omics, and cell-based assays. Interestingly, he's also trained as a cultural anthropologist and has done ethnographic fieldwork on spiritual traditions across the world. He received an honors bachelor's from Columbia University. He's originally from Mexico City, and he enjoys diving and surfing in his free time, so he's definitely living in a great location. Alex is the first author on a recent important paper, and this is the primary reason why I invited him to the podcast. It's called Neural and Molecular Changes During a Mind-Body Reconceptualization, Meditation, and Open-Label Placebo Healing Intervention. Now, for those who are not scientists, when you're the first author, it basically means you did most of the work, and so you're intimately familiar with all aspects of the study. This particular study compares biological measures before and after a Joe Dispenza week-long retreat. The topic of mind-body medicine is moving into the mainstream of accepted science. However, some continue to reject the idea that the mind has any substantive effect on the body. That's what makes this study and some of our other discussions so important. So I'm thrilled to have Alex here to talk in depth about his important study, the methods, the results, and the implications. So Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wonder if you could start with a bit about your background. You're from Mexico, but you trained in the US. How did that come about?
I grew up in Mexico City, but my family is international. So I decided to go to university in New York City and always had a very difficult time trying to figure out of all my different interests what to choose. But I've always been interested in science and in healing, and I grew up surrounded by a family of doctors and patients suffering from conditions that were difficult to treat because they fell into this mind-body sphere. So I was always drawn to that and to the scientific endeavor in the United States.
Okay. And you also put in the information that you sent me that you're interested in spiritual traditions, mystical experience, and you've done some ethnographic field work. That sounds really fascinating. What are some of the places that you've gone to study?
So I've studied spiritual traditions in Mexico. I grew up going to the mountains and exploring psychedelics before the current wave, and um, and then I did research on spiritual traditions in the United States, with New Age groups in Papua New Guinea, in Pakistan, Brazil, um, and yeah, many other countries. This is before I went into my doctoral studies.
You really got a lot of experience to bring, so I'm looking forward to where that's going to lead us. How did you find the team at San Diego? Sounds like the perfect fit for you.
Yes, I think it is. Well, UC San Diego is a very privileged place in the sense that there's a very keen interest on these topics and on studying things like non-pharmacological analgesia, and the effects of psychedelics and meditation in a way that is very open, and and at the same time embraced by the School of Medicine, which I think the trend is very much in that direction generally in science, but San Diego is a particularly great spot. It's just where a lot of very interesting people have gotten together to explore these topics.
Thank you. So maybe we'll dive into the study itself. And I thought before we get started, because whenever money is involved, people are, I guess, rightfully skeptical or want more information. And I know that the research is funded by an arm's length organization, like arm's length from Joe Dispenza's Encephalon organization. Can you just kind of describe the safeguards that are in place to make sure that the research being produced is, we'll say, as free from bias as possible?
Right. Um, I think, first of all, I'll say thank you for asking this question. I think it's incredibly important. So yes, the research is funded by the Inner Science Research Fund, which is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. Um, and like you said, it's an arm's length nonprofit, so it's not funded directly by Joe Dispenza's commercial enterprise. The funding flows through the university's standard institutional channels. And so it's subject to the university's full research compliance framework, as well as the IRB oversight for human research. Um, the studies were designed at UCSD, and they maintain full autonomy over how they're conducted and analyzed. Joe Dispenza is involved in monthly meetings with the research team. He's incredibly interested in the research and supports the work through in-kind donations. So it's a complex relationship that shouldn't be dismissed. But there are very important safeguards, including the ones I mentioned, plus independent peer review at the journals where we publish, the conflict of interest policies at UCSD, and we publish our data um, alongside the papers. So independent labs and people can access it and analyze it themselves, and we encourage that. And ultimately, we're very interested in the replicability of our methods and findings by other labs. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
think that open access is a really important safeguard. So much of not to pick on drug companies, but so much pharma data is hidden, right? And people can never really know for sure the accuracy or validity of the findings.
yeah, absolutely. And I would encourage readers to apply the same critical lens to this work as they would to any industry adjacent research. And the gold standard of science is very much independent replication. So I think that's super important.
Thanks. So I don't know if you can, again, we discussed a little bit before we started. Most of the listeners to this podcast are lay people, they're patients, they're people with complex chronic diseases with multiple symptoms who are, struggling to understand what's going on with them and seeking strategies to get better. So with that in mind, can you kind of describe the study, how it was envisioned and what you actually did?
Right. So the study combines a number of different interventions, which are presented together at many of Joe Dispenza's retreats, where there's a meditation component, and meditation is very interesting in and of itself, as a technique that has helped a lot of people obtain relief from um, conditions that are located in the mind-body interface, including pain and depression, anxiety, and other complex conditions. So meditation is a big component of these retreats. It's a style of meditation that is generally not um, hasn't been studied nearly as much as things like mindfulness meditation, and other related techniques. Um, and then there's a placebo component, which I call an open label placebo, because Joe Dispenza very much focuses a large part of his retreat on lectures where he presents this alternative view of how to conceive of our relationship to ourselves, to our minds, and our bodies, and to reality. And the idea is that if you change these very high level beliefs, then that is going to have a cascading effect, not just in the mind, but in how the mind affects the body, and ultimately in how we perceive ourselves and reality. So um, this I think, I make it, or I conceptualize of this as an open label placebo, for which there's an interesting scientific literature. And the idea behind an open label placebo is that if you give people a pill um, during a clinical trial where they don't know if it's a placebo or not, um, there's still an effect when it is a placebo, right? But there was an element of um, they were tricked a little bit because it could have been the active substance. But open label placebos are fascinating in that the placebo pill is labeled as placebo. So the person knows that they're taking a placebo. And what's fascinating is that the effect is still there. We still find these effects. And so what this tells us is that these are probably not mediated by expectations or mood effects, and it makes it much harder to dismiss the mechanisms of placebo as something that is simply getting in the way of compounds in pharmacology from doing their job. So I think of much of what he does in the retreats as a sophisticated version of these open label placebos, where you're entering a space in which there is a ritual component and there's a reconceptualization component. So the ritual component is where everybody is there to be healed, and um, there are specific times and activities that can catalyze this healing. And then there are these lectures where the idea that this can happen is presented, alongside hypothetical theories of how this may be the case.
Can you talk a little bit? I was just smiling so much when you were talking about the open label placebo because I've read some of the papers and I don't get it. So if I know that what I'm getting is a placebo, how could I explain that it shifts something in my biology?
That's a
It is like,
Mhm. Yeah, well, I think it sounds It sounds incredibly unlikely, because our way of thinking about biology is still very much split into this idea of the organic world, where the laws of chemistry are ultimately ruling everything, and everything else is just a consequence of how they interact with one another at higher levels of complexity. Whereas in reality, that's just half of the story. And the other half is that there are very complex feedbacks from those higher levels of complexity, all the way up to the conscious mind, back down to the organic building blocks, right? And this is something that is very new in science, not so new in healing disciplines that we call alternative and complementary. But the mechanisms behind that are very much being teased out and theorized about and found in disciplines like computational psychiatry, um, and um, and computational neuroscience. So, um, but more specifically, I think to your question, the it has to do with the way in which the brain works. Um, we have traditionally thought of the brain as the organ that perceives reality, both from the body, for example, in as pain, and from the outside, and that regulates it. However, the the more sophisticated reality, and scientific um, theories of the last few years suggest that it's not just a passively perceiving and controlling organ, but rather it is inferring reality by predicting it. And so, really, the way I think to think about the brain is that it's a prediction machine. It's it's a lot cheaper metabolically to build a model of the body and a model of the world and use it to predict what's happening in the body and in the world, and to use perception as a correction factor. So, so you're generating predictions about what's happening, and your conscious experience is mostly these predictions. And then the senses coming in from inside the body and from outside the body only need to provide a prediction error. So you're comparing that information coming in against the prediction, and you're correcting the prediction by the difference between those two. And that's a lot cheaper metabolically, energetically, than to, operate like a TV studio where you are essentially processing the entire image second to second.
So is that at all related? Joe Dispenza and others talk about how, like, they say a figure as high as 95% of all of our mental activity is taken up by the unconscious. And maybe that's what he's referring to, this prediction, correction. And if we don't change anything, we're just kind of on autopilot. So he talks about we're 95% on autopilot. And unless we make a specific decision to do something differently, we're going to kind of continue down that road.
Yes, I think you can very much think of that as a layman's version of what I'm talking about, which is hierarchical predictive coding in scientific terminology. So yes, essentially our predictions are going to rule the way that the system behaves, meaning they're going to rule how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive reality, and if we continue to operate that way, those pathways become reinforced. And so, how do you change that when it's not working out um, for you the is the crux of it. And I think there are three ways that he combines in his retreat that all three try to get at it, from different, slightly different means. And so I think scientifically, this study is particularly interesting because it's combining these three techniques that have been studied independently and independently have been shown to have an effect. What he's doing is he's putting them all together, in a very intensive form.
Can you talk about how the brain as a prediction machine? I was going to go at it in the opposite direction, but we seem to be going down this path, how it could lead to chronic symptoms or contribute. I don't even know if that's correct or not.
Right. So there's a very rich literature on this, both computationally and more and more empirically. So, for example, there's work showing that our perception of pain is particularly interesting, because it's something that is entirely a phenomenon of of above our necks. Below the neck, there's nociception, right? So there are signals going up, but those signals are always really going up. Those nociceptors are firing um, constantly, and at the same time, there's a threshold that is dynamic, above which that is sensed as pain, and below which there's no pain. And then there's the construction of the experience of pain, which is very much happening at a much higher level in the brain, and you can deconstruct it into different pathways. There's an affective emotional component of it, which generates the suffering, and then there's a sensory component of it, which results in the physical sensations of pain, like its intensity, its localization, and so forth. So to taking pain as an example, the ultimate experience or subjective perception of it is going to be um, a result of two things. One is the actual nociceptive firing coming from the body, potentially from a source of injury. And the other is going to be the predictive model that has been trained on that signal, and that is then going to issue predictions of pain. And so the idea behind the chronification of pain is that things are happening both in the periphery and in these central generative predictive models, that instead of sensing that the injury is was resolved, they keep predicting that the injury is there. So there's a predictive component that can lock in um, these conditions in place. And a similar thing is theorized to happen in cases of depression and anxiety, where the the system, bec- one of the ways in which that can get locked in, for example, is through avoidance, right? Because when we are when we are when there's an injury site, um, instead of and this also, by the way, applies to emotional pain. Whenever there is pain, we tend to avoid it. We tend to avoid um, touching the injury, moving the limb with the injury, and emotionally, exactly the same thing. We tend to avoid going to the places that hurt. The problem that when you have pain as a result that is at least partly predicted, is that the prediction model keeps thinking that the original injury is there, unless it's being updated by fresh sensory information. And and that means that it needs to be tested. In other words, it needs to be felt. And so if we feel the injury site after a week, the amount of nociceptive signaling and of inflammation will have gone down because of the body's natural healing abilities. But if we avoid that testing, that feeling, then the predictive model doesn't really update its predictions, and so it's going to keep predicting a high level of pain. And so through avoidance, these predictions can be locked in, and with enough time, they can become quite difficult to change. And so that's one of the explanations for how something acute can become something chronic.
And then there's certain aspects to the injury or to one's response to injury that can make that chronification more likely, perhaps, like if I'm very upset or there was trauma or a lot of adrenaline associated with the instance of the injury. Does that tend to lock it in a bit more?
Absolutely, and there's very interesting emerging research on um, things like soft tissue and how the 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 in the periphery and not just in the central nervous system, these things there are factors that can help lock in the pain that then um, they get reinforced by the central predictions. So in short, yeah.
So maybe now let's kind of pivot to the study. I think that provides a really nice background of what might be going on in the body that Joe Dispenza and others are trying to shift. And so maybe now, if you could describe the study and what you found.
Right. So the study took 20 participants in his retreats, some of whom were novices, so it was their first time attending. Others were had been to some of his retreats before, and we took biological measures and brain scans before the 1 week retreat and after it ended. And we compared a number of endpoints. Many of them came from blood plasma. So we drew blood and then analyzed a lot of factors from their blood plasma. And then we scanned their brains using functional magnetic resonance imaging before and after as well. And we found a number of interesting things. So when we compared, first we tried to characterize what was happening when they were meditating in the scanner. And we found that this style of meditation has some similarities to other more studied styles in that the way it changes the way in which the brain connects to itself. The different areas of the brain are connecting to themselves. In particular, there were two networks that are generally very active when somebody is resting, when somebody is not thinking about anything specific, but has their mind wandering. And these are the default mode network and the salience network. And an overactive default mode network, which has been hypothesized to be a very important part of where these predictions are generated, is associated with depression and other psychosomatic conditions. So what we saw is similar to what has been found in other meditation studies and has also been found in studies on psychedelics, is that when people are meditating, the integrity of this network goes down, meaning that the different areas of the brain that are generally talking to one another, making up this network, are talking to one another less so during meditation. So I think that was one of the more interesting findings in the brain. Another is that the modularity of the entire brain goes down. And by modularity, I mean the degree to which the brain is talking to itself through a geography of modules. So generally, the way that the brain works is it splits itself into different modules, or communities and of areas, and most of the talking happens within those communities, and a much lower percentage of talking happens between those communities. And that's quite efficient, metabolically speaking. But it also has been shown through a lot of other studies that that state is associated with a very prediction-driven state. So it's the state in which the predictive model is generally driving what we're experiencing. And what we found is that when people are meditating, every area starts talking to every area more. And these particular cliques dissolve. And that's similar to what others have found during acute psychedelic states, for example. And it's consistent with this idea that during the meditative state, you're sort of dissolving these predictions and allowing the system to enter into a different mode of functioning that can release some of them and allow the system to recode itself in a way that is more beneficial and closer to um, the actual reality of the body.
Right, because my understanding is these predictions are typically negative. Like because of the negativity bias, we pay more attention to things that are negative or dangerous, and we can really get in feedback loops quite easily.
Right. Yeah. And they behave like self-fulfilling prophecies. And so the idea is that by interrupting that state and entering into this alternative meditative state, you give the system an opportunity to take some distance away from them, and to be able to recode them. Um, of course, this is very much a hypothesis. The study itself just shows that, um, objectively, there's a lower, the brain becomes less modular during meditation. Um, what we also found that was interesting is we took these blood samples, and and I think this is quite unique because um, most studies about meditation have focused only on the brain. Very few actually also look at what's happening in the body. Um, and so what we saw was that there are important changes in the contents of the blood plasma of these same participants. And I think there were many changes. We looked at thousands of different proteins and metabolites, and I can go into a little bit of the methods behind that, and how that should be interpreted, which is cautiously. But one of the unambiguously very significant results was an upregulation of endogenous opioid, and these are the body's natural painkillers. So beta endorphin and dynorphin specifically. And this is something that we see across the placebo literature, for example. It's very well established that one of the ways in which placebo works is by increasing these natural painkillers. Um, so that's one thing that we saw. We also treated cells that we differentiated into neurons with the plasma of people from before and from after the retreat, and we saw that the cells exposed to the plasma of the people that had already gone through the retreat grew longer neurites, so longer axons and dendrites, to make more connections with other neurons. So So I thought that was very interesting because it shows, again, like other studies in the mind-body world, that these sorts of techniques are not just recoding things in the um, in the abstract sense, but actually there are factors in the blood that are encouraging neurons to grow and to create new connections.
So this would be some indication that the meditation was facilitating neuroplasticity.
Right.
Mm.
That's what this suggests. Yes, um, and this is very much exploratory. The idea behind the study was we can't really isolate all of these different techniques that Joe Dispenza is teaching, plus the fact that people are taking a break from their lives, um, and and there's an expectation because they're investing time and money into this, and so there's so many different factors that are coming into this experience. But the idea was let's see what the overall biological changes of the entire experience are, and let's use that in order to generate new hypotheses that we can then test in a much more targeted way, to really then see, okay, um, this might be the mechanism through which the specific technique is operating, and these might be the molecular pathways involved. That's very much beyond the scope of the study. The idea here was to explore what this looks like in the blood and in the brain.
What were some of the other findings?
So we found we did analysis on the metabolites in the blood, on the proteins present, and on the transcriptomics, the RNA inside these extracellular vesicles called exosomes, and which are one of the ways in which cells in the body communicate with other cells in the body at a distance. And we found um, interesting changes. For example, we found that there were inflammatory factors that went up, as well as anti-inflammatory factors that went up, both at the same time. It's hard to interpret exactly what that means, but we think um, that when you're going through such an intensive experience and a lot of the past is showing up, and at least anecdotally this is what people report, is that when they're meditating, a lot of their past, including traumatic memories, surface. And this is consistent with this idea that there's an opportunity to recode these experiences. So I think there's an element of stress that is involved in that. And this is not simply, all about vacationing and relaxing. And at the same time, there's anti-inflammatory factors that are becoming upregulated, suggesting that there's at the same time a process through which these changes in the mind are signaling to the body that there needs to be less inflammation. So that was one of the interesting findings. We saw a significant change in the tryptophan pathway. Um, Tryptophan is interesting because it's the precursor for serotonin, which is an incredibly important neurotransmitter for mood, um, and and many other things, uncertainty modulation as well, and um, so there are these very significant changes in those pathways, and this was only in 20 participants, which is a very significant limitation. 20 is quite small for a scientific study, but the fact that these were statistically significant is pretty suggestive.
Anything else you want to highlight about the studies? The results.
So we saw changes in neurotransmitter profiles at a transcriptomic level in the exosomes, which we think are interesting. And what else? Think. Oh yeah, one more thing that popped up, which is particularly interesting, is we saw metabolic changes. So
Right. Yeah.
and this is something that I think we just need to do a lot more research on this because meditation has been proposed, decades ago to be this hypometabolic state where overall the metabolism of the body is downregulated. And anecdotally, this checks out with a lot of reports by long-term meditators where um, there's a lower calorie consumption that is associated with being in a deep meditative state, as if the body can switch into this more energy efficient way of functioning. And this is also something that has been proposed for psychedelics ever since the Doors of Perception by Huxley and so on. So but what we found was that the cells that were exposed to the blood plasma of people from after the retreat became more glycolytic as compared to the cells exposed to the plasma from people coming into the retreat. Um, and there are basically two kinds of metabolism that cells can do. One is um, through oxidative phosphorylation, and another one is through glycolysis. And glycolysis is it's a lot faster, and it creates fewer ATP molecules than oxidative phosphorylation. So we're not exactly sure what it means that we're seeing this shift. But there is some literature on Tibetan Buddhist monks showing the same thing, that after intensive meditation, the cells are shifting over to this glycolytic um, metabolism. So we think that's very interesting. It's hard to know exactly how to interpret that at this point.
Thank you. So, what are your take-home messages from the research and maybe the directions that you're going now?
Um, I mean, I think the biggest take home message is that mind body techniques work, and that there's a lot that we don't know about why they work and how they work, and so we need to um, investigate this and really invest in rigorous ways of looking into this. I think it's mostly um, the the patients and the non-medical community that has traditionally pushed this into the mainstream, and I think that's been great. But I think this is a big uh, moment for the scientific community and the medical community um, to really realize that there is something here. I think the other big takeaway is, um, especially for patients, is that the m- the mind really does matter, and it matters beyond just attitude and mood and expectation. Those things matter a lot, but there's also things that go beyond that. There really is this very profound way in which the mind affects the body and the body affects the mind, um, to the point where there's a randomized placebo controlled trial that I cite in the paper, which shows that um, people that suffer from chronic low back pain that are given a specific type of treatment where the main component of it is that you change the way in which you think of your pain, from one in which you're thinking of it as an injury that is physical in the body to one in which um, the pain was originally caused by that, but it is a constructed experience in the brain, and the brain is an organ with plasticity. And so simply changing the way you think about it had dramatic results, positive results on pain that went up above and beyond placebo, by a factor, by a very significant factor. So these things really do matter, and they can make a big difference. And at the same time, they're incredibly difficult because you're sort of dealing with your own mind, and changing our minds is especially difficult. I mean, it's difficult as it is, but when you're in pain, or when you're suffering from something, it's even more difficult. So I think our study shows that these rituals help, that they create a container for these changes to happen. Um, and I think the third takeaway is that we need a new way to think about. We need new ways to think about what is happening between the mind and the body, because a lot of people are, especially in the medical and scientific community, um, are understandably uncomfortable at these sorts of findings because they threaten a lot of the assumptions on which very respectable and important science was built.
Right.
And so we need to find ways to integrate these findings in a way that isn't threatening to um, to these scientific assumptions, while being very, very rigorous, and doing good science.
I want to, this is like a little bit off topic, but you've mentioned psychedelics a few times. And then I think I heard you say some of the opening up of the brain to neuroplasticity and letting go of some of the predictions that keep us stuck in place that happened in the Joe Dispenza subjects have some similarities to what happens when people use psychedelics. Did I hear that correctly?
I personally think so. There's very few studies directly comparing these sorts of meditation-based and retreat interventions to psychedelic interventions. Um, But at the same time, a lot of the findings of the world of contemplative science and meditation and psychedelic science converge in very interesting ways. And I think the link between them is that they're both acting on this predictive system. They're both helping to recode these states. Um, and Joe Dispenza speaks a lot about the mystical and mystical experience as something that is healing, and these psychedelic substances pretty reliably produce these mystical experiences. And what's interesting about them is that in classical pharmacology, there's something we always expect, which is a dose response curve. If you give people a higher dose, then the biological response is going to be higher, up to a certain point. With psychedelics, which are a pharmacological substance and have a pathway, this is absolutely uh, missing from them, which is fascinating, right? Because you can give somebody a very low dose of a psychedelic, and it can heal them. It can really help them overcome their depression. And you can also give a person an incredibly high dose and not heal them. And so what scientists doing these early studies found was that there was a mediating factor that explained this discrepancy. And that was the extent to which the person had had a mystical experience. So if a very low dose created a mystical experience, then that meant that they got relief. If a very high dose did not manage to create that mystical experience, then the relief did not occur. So it was the experience that was actually absolutely instrumental in causing the relief. And these molecules are facilitating or pushing the system towards having that experience. Um, and they're very interesting because if you resist, if you really don't want to have the experience, you won't have it. So there's a way in which both these meditation and reconceptualization and ritual practices and these psychedelic substances are acting on a part of the system that is a lot closer to consciousness. And we really don't understand consciousness, but they're perturbing the system in this very peculiar space, which is really fascinating.
Maybe just as we wind up here, if you can share what are your future directions, what's your team working on now?
So we're working on a number of different things. There are upcoming studies, including some that have controlled conditions where there are subjects that participated in the retreat and others that took some time off and vacationed in the same resort. And so we compare those two. Um, and there are studies looking at other biological endpoints from these same retreats, more in the body as opposed to in the brain. And we're also starting to work where I'm starting to work with plant medicine, and we're very interested in how, as I was speaking, there are these convergent pathways between psychedelics and meditation. And so at a biological level, we're very interested in precisely where those two meet. So yeah.
Just kind of blown my mind a little bit. There's so much more to learn, which is always exciting. If people want to follow your work or the work of your group, where would they be able to do that?
So well, for me personally, I'm available via email. I have a website, um, which I'll share, but it's alejandrojinich.com. I have an Instagram account, which is mostly not about science and more about nature, but Alex Jinich.
Okay.
And then our group has a website, which I think will soon be updated with a newer version of it. I can share all those links.
Okay. That's great. Anything maybe just to finish that you want to leave people with, tips or hope or kind of your final message to the listeners?
I think I know a lot of people, and including myself, who have obtained immense relief from these alternative and complementary techniques. So I would encourage people to explore and to try them and to do so in a way that is that balances um, being critical and rational, but also suspending disbelief.
Thank you so much, Alex. It was really a pleasure to hear more about your work and some of the tantalizing information like the predictive processing is definitely something I'm planning to dive into and learn more about. So thanks for introducing me to that.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining me on the Dr. Eleanor Stein podcast. I hope you are taking away new strategies and ideas to improve your health and a renewed sense of hope. Join me, Dr. Eleanor Stein, for our next episode. Can't wait? Check out my website for a wealth of free resources.